Thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm Jessica Mwiza, and I'm a French and Rwandan scholar, a researcher at the Graduate Center here at CUNY. And my research actually focuses on post-genocide generation in Rwanda and identity formation. So basically, how young people are interpreting their identity with 32 years of anti-racist policies in Rwanda, in post-genocide Rwanda. But here, we are here to talk about the genocide against the Tutsi. We usually commemorate from this month during the 3 months when the genocide took place. The words kwibuka in Kinyarwanda means to remember, and remembering is a form of education and justice. It's a resistance against the forces that would prefer certain truth to remain buried. So 32 years ago, between April and July 1994, more than 1 million Tutsi were assassinated in Rwanda. It was not a simple war or a simple chaos or spontaneous violence, but a systematic, planned, and ideologically prepared campaign of extermination directed against Rwanda's Tutsi population. I need to insist on that, even if we are here in the US, but in Europe and in Africa, we have a huge problem of denialism. And it's usually along those lines of, oh, they just killed each other. It was spontaneous from like one day to another. They took machetes and they started to kill their neighbors. So that's not the real story. And I'm going to try to explain the ideology and the myth that surround the genocide ideology in Rwanda. So to understand how a racial ideology is constructed, we must first understand what existed before it. And the story of Rwanda before European colonization is, in many important ways, the story of what had to be destroyed in order for genocide to become possible. So the people of Rwanda shared and still share a language, Kinyarwanda, across the entirety of the territory. They shared a religion, with a king, a body of law, and a rich oral tradition of proverbs, rituals, and myths that constituted a common moral universe. You have the Rwandan scholar Antoine Mugezera observes that even within the foundational myth of Rwanda, the story of Gihanga, considered like the mythical ancestor of Rwandan people, the figure is neither Hutu nor Tutsi. Gihanga is the father of 3 children, Gahutu, Gatutsi, and Gatwa. And the myth, in its alternating form, concerns the distribution of social roles and responsibilities based on merit and character, never on biological destiny. The terms Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa certainly existed in pre-colonial Rwanda, not everywhere though, not in each and every region in Rwanda, but they were not what European racial science would later make of them. They were social categories, again, fluid, contextual, and sometimes referring to occupational relationships. For example, the cattle herders, the farmer, sometimes indicating status within a royal court. Also, you had a son within a royal family who was considered a Hutu in relationship to his father because he served him. But this position was temporary. When he became a father himself, he would assume a different role. So the categories were also permeable. A poor Tutsi who lost his cattle will become a Hutu, while a Hutu who accumulated enough cattle and wealth might be absorbed into the Tutsi social class. You have also one ancient ritual in Rwanda, the ritual of Kubangwa, one of Rwanda's central spiritual practices that captures this fluidity perfectly. So in the incantation, the practitioner calls for protection from poisoners who might be Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. So the evil is not really racialized. The danger is not racial. It belongs to individuals, never to groups. And as Mugezera writes in his analysis of the pre-colonial periods, before the colonial period, one does not find in Rwandan collective imagination elements opposing Hutu or Tutsi or vice versa. The fundamental ideology is unifying. So this does not mean that Rwanda was a perfect paradise before colonization. Of course, you had wars, brutality, especially between clans for power. But none of these wars could be attributed to racial antagonism between essentially different biological groups. That idea did not yet exist, and it will have to be imported. So then the Europeans arrive and they bring with them their imagination. So in 1894, the German Count Gustav Adolf von Goetzen became the first European to cross Rwanda and encounter its authorities. He will go on to become the first governor of German East Africa, and his arrival began the colonial period. But really importantly, the intellectual construction of Rwanda had begun long before that, in the studies, fantasies, and speculations of European travelers, zoologists, physicians, and explorers who had never set foot in the Great Lakes region. You have French historian Jean-Pierre Chrétien, who even dates this to like the Middle Age. They were thinking of this ancient people close to the source of the Nile and had tons and tons of fantasies about the people of Rwanda, of the Great Lake region. So to understand the Hamitic hypothesis, the foundational ideology of the genocide against the Tutsi, we need to follow the construction from its origin. In 1858, the British explorer Speck published his theories about the people of this region in a chapter of his journal titled, without irony, Theory of Conquest of Inferior by Superior Races. So Speck looked at the Wahuma people, the Hima from the region, who are supposed to be the cousins of the Tutsi. And he called them a semi-Chem Hamitic people and concluded that the sophistication of the Great Lakes civilization could only be explained by the presence of a non-so-black foreign conquering race. And he writes, it appears impossible to believe, judging from the physical appearance of the Wahuma, that they can be of any other race than the semi-Chem Hamitic of Ethiopia. And he describes how these foreign invaders took the government from its people and have ruled over them ever since, leaving the agricultural aborigines, indigenous, to till the grounds. So here in the imagination of this Victorian British explorer is the entire architecture of the future genocide assembled way before any European actually had ever met a Tutsi. So this is the Tutsi, the Hima as a foreign conqueror, the Hutu as the indigenous victim, the racial hierarchy as natural law, if I can say so. And so you have an entire continent's history reduced to the gift that one supposedly superior race confers on inferior ones. This was mainstream science, published in thoughts in European universities everywhere, and shaping the minds of the colonial administrators, missionaries, and politicians for generations. And then the Belgians arrived in Rwanda after World War I, inheriting the German territory, and they also brought this science with them and made it into policy. So the Belgian colonial enterprise in Rwanda represents one of the most consequential acts of racial engineering in modern history. What they found in Rwanda, again, a coherent, sophisticated nation with a complex political culture, they systematically reinterpreted through the lens of the Hamitic hypothesis, of these other people coming from Northern Africa, maybe Ethiopia, coming down in center of Africa to civilize the indigenous people there. So this myth, this invention. And in 1927, the Belgian far-right journalist Pierre Daye described the Tutsi as a proto-Semitic pastors coming from the borders of Abyssinia. So then again, that region in Northern Africa. And distinguishing them from the Hutu, quote, who offered the classic image of the Negro. Then you have the French historian Louis de Laguet, whose 1939 History of Rwanda was required reading for each and every Catholic missionary arriving in the country until the genocide, until 1994, insisted that the Tutsi were a branch of the Kushites, Ethiopians or Hamites coming from Upper Egypt or Abyssinia, with a Caucasian type also related to the Semites of the Middle East. And when the scientific evidence was inconvenient or simply absent, they invented more elaborate theories. Scholars speculated even about primordial races from Afghanistan, about mysterious cataclysms that scattered superior peoples across continents, and about the racial meaning of nose shapes, of skull measurements. You even have an anthropologist, a Belgian, Jean Yernot, commissioned by Belgium, of course, to study this question definitely. They needed to really put it in scholarship globally. And he was commissioned by Belgium to study this question, and he built his research sample by selecting only Rwandans who already matched his preconceived image of each group. So basically, he was searching for people tall with thin features and then called them Tutsi. Then he was searching for people short with maybe a larger nose, and then he called them Hutu. He fabricated the entire thing. And even he, in his own study, admitted that nutrition and differences in living standards could produce the physical differences he was measuring. Because basically, when you're rich and you have access to milk and good meats, you maybe will grow taller. That's actually science. But he twisted it with anthropology to say that the Tutsi people, the tall people, were coming from Ethiopia. So you have, again, a pre-colonial social system in which the categories of Hutu and Tutsi were fluid, contextual, non-biological, being transformed under the pressure of European racial theory into a rigid biological hierarchy. And the Belgium administration completed this transformation in 1933 by introducing identity cards that marked every Rwandan with their racial category. Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. I didn't explain, but the Twa were supposed to be the pygmies, so inhabitants of the forests, and that's also why they were shorter, because they were like living in a very hard landscape, and they are rarely mentioned because they were like 0.3% of the population. That's why I'm not going to talk much about them. So then you have, like the sociologist Colette Guillaumin, in her foundational study of racist ideology, she identifies precisely this moment in the history of European racism, the shift from seeing human differences as fluid and historically produced to seeing them as biological and immutable. So the walls were built by the colonizers, and then the colonizers pretended the walls had always been there. So here we encounter one of the most important and consistently overlooked mechanism of racial ideology. Sorry, the two generation of stereotypes. The positive stereotypes that precedes the negative one. This is a pattern with profound implications, not only for understanding Rwanda, but for understanding racism as a system wherever we encounter it. So the first generation of racial stereotypes in Rwanda, from roughly the beginning of colonization until 1950s, was systematically favorable to the Tutsi. Not to all Tutsi, but to some Tutsi in the richest families. So the colonizers constructed them as superior, a race of lords, polished, refined, dominating again the Bahutu. They were calling them, of course, Negroes with flat noses and everything. But you have to notice what was happening to the Hutu simultaneously. They were being described in terms of the most brutal negrophobia of the time: lazy, childlike, servile, created for servitudes. Even families of chiefs who had governed for generations and generations were stripped of their positions and replaced with Tutsi administrators. So Hutu access to higher education was also severely restricted. And in the colonial imagination, the Hutu were the perfect image of the colonial Negro, useful as labor, invisible as human being. But you have to understand that so-called positive stereotype is actually exotization, is the preparation for the massacres to come. So when the Tutsi were exoticized as noble, pharaonic even, quasi-European, they were being set up, their intelligence rebranded as cunning, their elegance as manipulation, and their pride as arrogance. And it is all the preparation for the scapegoating. And that moment came in the late 1940s and early 1950s when the Tutsi monarchy, the Mwami, it's the name for a king in Kinyarwanda, began pressing for independence. And they were inspired by the broader wave of anti-colonial movement, of course, from Lumumba's Congo to Nkrumah's Ghana. So the colonial power, faced with the loss of control, needed to neutralize this royalist independence movement. And the solution was, of course, to flip the stereotype from positive to negative. So the second generation of stereotype, which Mugesera notifies as beginning around 1950, transformed everything that has been used to praise the Tutsi into instruments of dishumanization, demonization even. Their intelligence became deviousness, their social cohesion became secret conspiracy, their supposed foreign origin, the Hamitic myth, was now reframed not as the origin of civilization, but as the mark of the alien, the invader, the colonizer within. The Tutsi were not now the internal enemy, and the Hutu, previously dismissed as servile, were recast as the true people of Rwanda, the democratic majority, the oppressed masses against their feudal lords. And this reversal was orchestrated. Its architects were Belgian colonial administrators and Catholic missionaries, figures like Monsignor Perraudin, who in 1959 wrote a lot of racist theories about the Tutsi and the Hutus. So these missionaries who had built the Hamitic ideology were now using it as a lever to dismantle the Tutsi monarchy that stood in the way of Belgian control and later a politically convenient neocolonial arrangements. So this is really the structural element of the ideological manipulation. This colonial administration had to make the Hutu forget that it was Belgium, not ever the Tutsi, that had restructured and hardened Rwanda's social hierarchy. It was Belgium that had imposed the racial identity card system. It was Belgium that had stripped Hutu chiefs of their positions and replaced them with Tutsi ones. And it was Belgium that had instituted forced labor practices. But now, the hatred that might have been directed at the colonial power was redirected at the Tutsi. The Hutu were told, in effect, your oppressor is not the European. Your oppressor is your neighbor. So you have the political weapon, political parties, manifestos, and the construction of enmity. The most extreme early party in Rwanda was Apos Roma, whose principal spokesperson, Gitera Habyarimana, was the first politician to say, the enemy of Rwanda is the Tutsi. He was also the first to call them snakes. He invited Hutu youth to arm themselves with hoes to exterminate the Tutsi. And this was in the late 1950s. So again, when you hear, oh, one day they took the machetes and start to kill their neighbors, that's not it. 1994, but it started in the 50s. And it even started with ideology, pre-colonization ideology. So the vocabulary of extermination was established really early. The deshumanizing metaphor of the reptile, which would return in the radio broadcasts of 1994, was already being deployed in the 50s. Against this stood the UNAR, the Royalist and Nationalist Party, which categorically rejected racial ideology and called for the unity of all Rwandans against colonialism. So UNAR's platform read today as a model of clarity because it condemned, I quote, all racial discrimination between blacks and whites or between Rwandan themselves, and pointed directly at the colonial manipulation of racial divisions as an instrument of domination. So UNAR was really attacked by Belgian administration, labeled alternately communist or Islamist. This dual accusation that colonial and Cold War powers reached for whenever a liberation movement threatened their interests. And in response to UNAR's independence push, came in the form of the Manifeste des Bahutu, the Hutu Manifesto, a document that formalized the racial reading of Rwandan society and argued that the Hutu people faced two colonialism, that of the European, yes, but first that of the Tutsi. These documents, drafted under Belgian encouragement and church influence, established the template for all subsequent anti-Tutsi political rhetoric. It took the structure of anti-colonial liberation, the oppressed majority rising against an occupying foreign minority, and redirected it against a domestic population. So this is a maneuver of extraordinary sophistication and cynicism. The leaders of the Hutu power movement absorbed the language of democracy, majority rights, social justice, anti-colonialism, and used it to build a project of racial exclusion. As Mugesera again observes, the counter-elite Hutu could not appropriate the idea of class struggle without risking provoking the anger of colonial authorities obsessed with anti-communism. And so the powerful populist strategy was conceived to formulate a class struggle using the vocabulary of race struggle. So the first president of the Hutu power movement, Gregoire Kayibanda, the founder of the Hutu party, was also an admirer of Adolf Hitler, who had read much German literature and made many comments about Hitler and his party. His contemporary reportedly gave him the nickname Hitler, which he adopted as a compliment. So two of the most murderous ideologies of the 20th century, colonial negrophobia and European anti-Semitism, converged in the political imagination of the architects of the genocide against the Tutsi. And this is really not accidental. The Tutsi in the second generation of stereotype were explicitly constructed as the Jews of Africa. Their supposed intelligence, their alleged secret networks of influence, their supposed goal for domination, these were the tropes of classical anti-Semitic propaganda transplanted into African context. So the parallels with the protocols of the elders of Zion, for example, were really structural. When you understand that the people who planned the genocide against the Tutsi had consciously modeled their ideology on Nazi anti-Semitism, the event of 1994 ceased to be incomprehensible. So that's really important to make that parallel. So now you have the mechanics of genocide, media, propaganda, and the manufacture of fear. We cannot omit the role of media. If the intellectual architecture of genocide was built by European scholars and missionaries, the operational mechanism that prepared ordinary Rwandans to participate in or accept the genocide against the Tutsi was constructed in the years immediately before 1994. With a particular intensity from 1990 onwards. So in December 1990, the newspaper Kangura, meaning to wake others in Kinyarwanda, published its 6th issue. and it contained what it called the Hutu 10 Commandments, a racial code of conduct that formalized the exclusion and dehumanization of Tutsi in every domain of Rwandan life. The commandments forbade Hutu men from marrying Tutsi women. Actually, I'm going to go back to the slide on women. Doing business with Tutsis or holding any friendship with them. And they demanded that all positions of power, military, economic, educational, political, be reserved exclusively for Hutu. When you read the first commandments, every Hutu should know that a Tutsi woman, whoever she is, works for the interests of her Tutsi ethnic group. The Tutsi woman is constructed here as a weapon, a biological instrument of conspiracy. So Kangura will also as well call her she who causes vertigo, so a sexual and a racial threat. And it will claim that even Tutsi women married Hutu men only to make children with their own racial brothers. So imagine the level of conspiracy. When Tutsi women are marrying Hutu men, it's supposedly to still have children with their race, and so to manipulate their Hutu husbands to advance the cause of the race. So the particular horrors visited upon Tutsi women during the genocide were prepared by this ideological infrastructure systematically in the years before. And also you had the Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, RTLM, which began broadcasting in July 1993, and its format was really accessible and popular. You must understand that in Rwanda, back then, the majority of the population never got to school, so they couldn't read. So even Kangura was only accessible for the intellectuals. But the radio was in each and every house, on every hill, countryside, or Kigali, the capital. So its format was really accessible, popular, music, jokes, calls in, the informal ease of the community radio, and intercut with all of it with genocide. The RTLM called Tutsi Inyenzi, cockroaches, Inzoka, snakes, and this was one of the first mass media outlets in the world to explicitly call for murder. During the 100 days of genocide, RTLM functions as a command and control mechanism, literally giving orders to killers and militias on the streets. We saw that family running here. We saw that family hiding there. We saw Tutsi cockroaches on that street behind those walls. It was really a command and control mechanism. And it was also used to shame those who hesitated, and to frame also each and every act of massacre as self-defense. And this is not accessory, this is really important. So, okay, here I'm not gonna spend much time, so we have time for questions. We really have to understand that in 1994, the genocide against the Tutsi was carried out in part thanks to identity cards, documents the Belgian colonial administration had imposed in 1933 to make racial categories legible and permanent. At roadblocks throughout Rwanda, killers checked these cards. Are you a Tutsi? Are you a Hutu? If you're a Hutu, you can go. If you're a Tutsi, most likely you will be killed at the roadblock. And in case where there were no cards, because sometimes, of course, people were saying that they lost it or they were trying to falsify it, the killers used other tools to decide. They measured height. They measured the length of the nose. They assessed the shape of the face. They used, in other words, the measurement criteria of colonial racial science, the instrument built by Jean Hiernaut, whose anthropological methodology had helped cement racial categories into Belgian colonial policy decades before. So the intellectual architecture of genocide became literally the architecture of murder. And this is why we are here today, not only to be sad because we are still in the 3 months of mourning and commemorating, but to understand all of this for prevention purpose. The genocide against the Tutsi was made possible by the systematic application of ideas that were not unique to Rwanda. As you know, the Hamitic hypothesis drew on the same intellectual traditions that produced scientific racism in Europe and America, that justified slavery, apartheid, segregation, and that animated the Holocaust. So the mechanisms of dishumanization, the racial identity cards, the dehumanizing metaphors, the conspiracy theory about a group's supposed plot for domination, they constructed archaeology of grievance, the positive racism that prepares negative racism, and these are the common property of supremacist thoughts wherever it appears. So when we see those mechanisms at work today, in the rhetoric of white nationalists in America, in Europe, in the dehumanizing language directed at immigrants and minorities, in the conspiracy theories about Jewish or Muslims or so-called Black power that circulate on social media today with algorithmic amplification, we are looking at the same architecture. The material might be different from one country to another, from one region to another. The targeted group changes, with now, for example, the far right pretending they care about Jewish communities. The medium evolves, but the structure remains the same. So Kwibuka, to remember, is an act of vigilance for those who are still alive. It's the commitment to recognize racial ideology, especially in the earliest and the most ordinary manifestation, in the pseudo-scientific language that naturalizes social hierarchy, in the media that frames, and social media that frames a human community as a threat, in the politics that transforms a political grievance into a racial identity. So the people who conceived the genocide against the Tutsi, again, were students of history. They were highly educated people. They attended school in France, Belgium, Germany sometimes. And they studied the Holocaust. They borrowed its vocabulary, talking about final solution. They borrowed its symbols, its logic, to portray yourself, even if you're the perpetrator, as the victim, to invent massacres, to invent stories in order to disseminate fear among the population. And they understood that genocide does not begin ever with machetes or camps. It begins with ideas. And so the last thing I need to say before welcoming your questions is that we need to be better students than them. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Laura?
Thank you so much for your presentation. You really talked about all of these interconnections. So I have two questions for you. The first is, could you talk a little bit about how you feel? I'm a little older, and I remember when we referred to this as the Rwandan genocide and the shift to a different title for the genocide. And the second would be, it's now 32 years. What are some of the challenges that you see in talking about and commemorating what happened?
So Rwandan genocide was a convenience label that was used mainly by the perpetrator themselves, because towards the end of the genocide, they were realizing that they were losing the war, that the diaspora coming from other countries in Africa were really winning the war. So they were thinking, international justice is coming for us. So they started to really emphasize on this was not a genocide. This was a spontaneous violence, an outburst of rage and violence. And when it was not possible for them to deny the genocide because journalists were there, testimonies were being offered in each and every capital in the Western world, they started to accept, okay, this is a genocide. But if there was a genocide against the Tutsi, there was also a genocide against the Hutu. Therefore, we have to name it Rwandan genocide. Sometimes it can appear as a simple mistake people sometimes say, oh, I didn't know, I was calling it Rwandan genocide, but I didn't know. But on the side of the perpetrators and their allies, this is a real strategy to call it a Rwandan genocide so that there are no responsibilities and they can also escape justice. The justice question is really important because we have so many perpetrators being just free today, living in France, Belgium, the US, sometimes Canada, but mostly in Africa, in neighboring countries in Rwanda. And they, since the past 32 years, they have continued writing books, articles, organizing conferences like this one to share their own version of the story. And they will always use Rwandan genocide, of course. The second question about commemorating 32 years after will be answered differently. For example, I know that many survivors are saying that it's harder today than 32 years before, that even the ideology, anti-Tutsi ideology, always finds new way to perpetuate itself, new language, new metaphors, new comparisons. Those past few months, they have been comparing their situation to the Palestinians, conveniently. 10 years before it was another metaphor comparison, 20 years before it was another. So they never stop thinking, they never stop creating ways to deny the genocide. And it's becoming harder and harder because survivors are not allowed to move on. They're not allowed to heal because it's a constant fight. And it's becoming more and more violent after the years, I will say. And also because we feel like scholars and also survivors, the empathy was not there during the genocide. There were so little journalists on the ground because they were covering the Football World Cup and the end of the apartheid in South Africa. So the empathy was really not there. And when people were interested in sometimes seeing the footages or listen to the testimonies, they quickly revolt to, okay, these are Africans killing each other. No political ideas, nothing to debate here. And it became worse and worse, even with Rwanda developing itself, because now it's fueling the ideology in return. People are like, why is Rwanda doing so well now? Sounds weird. What are these Tutsi people doing? So even the narrative that maybe you've heard on the Rwandan miracle is actually also fueling genocide ideology and denial. So yeah, thank you for your question.
I have a question. In your presentation, I noticed that you had indicated that Belgium inherited. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, Belgium inherited Rwanda. And I was very curious about that use of that word inherited, and I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that.
So it will be because, of course, Germany lost World War I, and that I'm not actually very fluent on these political details, but they recuperated Germany's colonies. Not all of them, but Burundi and Rwanda for sure. So that's maybe what I meant by inherited.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't explain much about the genocide itself, so if you also have questions about how it unfolded during 3 months, I can also answer these.
I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. And the only question I have is back to before Belgium inherited. You said there was a lot of even propaganda then, before the radio, before everything. It was just one-sided. But the one thing is was that before Belgium, anyone came around? It was just Tutsi and Hutu? It was just them?
So before colonization, as I said, Tutsi and Hutu were categories, social categories in Rwanda. So yeah, it could be used in different situations. Like I explained, sometimes when you had a son, because he is your son, and in the culture he's supposed to serve you, you can call him your Hutu. But then when he grow up and becomes a father, you cannot call him your servant. You cannot call him your Hutu. In some situations also, let's say you have a neighbor, you get along very well, and you decide, because he's your best friend, to gift him cows. So in that situation, because you're richer than him, you're his Tutsi and he's your Hutu. But it was never something to diminish the person. And if that same person will have another transactional relationship with someone, where he's the wealthier, he will be the other person's Tutsi, and the other person will be his Hutu. And also in some part of Rwanda, and that's really important to mention, there were no use of Tutsi and Hutu at all. It depended. Like even in Rwanda, the culture was not so unified about using those words. Now your question about in Europe, those ideas, it can be traced back to the Middle Ages, because there were a lot of fantasies about the people all around the world, and especially surrounding this area with the sources of the Nile. It really nourished so many stories, mythologies, and they were supposedly an ancient people closer to like the biblical people living in this deep heart of Africa. And that's also why explorers were eager to go there, but they couldn't always, because it was dangerous, full of diseases, and so many died trying to actually go to Rwanda, but they were in neighboring countries, but they were still thinking about these people, naming them so many names, and imagining an ancient migration from northern parts of Africa to civilized classical African Negro. So these were really, really ancient mythologies.
Thank you.
Welcome. And that's something I actually sometimes struggle to explain, because when we talk about races, people want to imagine white against black. Or like the Asian positionality in these racial hierarchies. But when all of these theories were built in Europe, they were also building subcategories of races amongst the people of Africa, naming who is supposedly closer to the whites and who is further away from white people and humanity. So this is really the same ideology. This is racist European ideology, even if it's seen as among Africans.
I have two more questions for you. I've had the privilege of being in Kigali once, and I went to some of the memorials, and on the drive there, the person who worked at the Kigali Museum was talking about particular areas where there had been tsetse flies and the geographic segregation of people. So I was wondering, I have two questions. One is, could you talk a little bit about how those kinds of memorials and churches come about? And then also, if you have time, if you could talk a little bit about gacaca and post-conflict justice.
So the geography of memory in Rwanda is spectacular, because the genocide took place everywhere. Inside houses, on the streets, in churches, in stadiums, literally everywhere in the country. We have now memorials, again, everywhere throughout the country. Sometimes we have small memorials, like, for example, at the scale of the neighborhood, with often mass graves in it, because when we talk about more than 1 million Tutsi killed during the genocide, it's actually really more than 1 million. Sometimes you will hear about other numbers, 500,000 or 800,000, but these were numbers that were just published really quickly at the end of the genocide. You have to know that each and every year, at the occasion of, I don't know, a construction work, a new building, people start to dig, and then they will find another mass grave. Sometimes it's really enormous. Sometimes it's a little grave, but it's still significant. So for the past 32 years, each and every time in Rwanda we find a mass grave, we try to build a commemorative place at the same spots. When we talk about churches, stadiums, and schools, it also has an important history, because during the massacres during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, Tutsi people were actually able to find refuge. They will gather in churches, they will gather in stadiums, they will ask for the peacekeeping force, for example, to keep them safe, or their neighbors to help them, and it will work. It will actually work during these massacres. But in 1994, it became a trap. So the Hutu power leaders from the 7th of April told the Tutsi population, so yeah, things are dangerous now. You should go seek refuge in your local church, at your local stadium, in that school that was just built, like, for example, the Murambi site. So the Tutsi, of course, they were used to it. They were so used to these things. So they will gather and try to seek help and try to also outnumber the perpetrators. They were feeling like maybe it will be safer to be 100, 1,000 people gathered here and facing the same danger. But in 94, it became a trap. So the militias, the armies, the police, the neighbors, they were like preparing to attack those churches, those stadiums, those schools with grenades, with firearms, with machetes, with fire, with everything they could find. And so it made the genocide easier to perpetrate. So we now have a lot of memorial sites that are churches, that are stadiums, that are schools, and we try to offer like a decent place for the people we lost and for their families to gather each and every year to put flowers and have like some thoughts and prayers. And also we try to have museums on the sites of really big massacres, genocidal massacres, to explain the unfolding of events, to explain also the international complicities, because sometimes you will find that in Bisisero, in the region of Kibuye, a French contingent of the army was also there, not so far, and did nothing. You will also find that in a school, for example, Ito, you had a contingent of Belgians, peacekeeping force that also left the Tutsi to their faith. So it's all commemorative and educational, and it's literally everywhere throughout the country.
So I have a question on your opinion. So I see the whole situation, and it's not to diminish what the people went through, but I feel like it was a boiling pot between brothers and sisters, all pushed together through propaganda, through the Europeans. In your opinion, besides obviously, being prejudiced, racist against each other, what do you feel like the people could have done differently besides listening to all the propaganda and stuff? Like what do you feel like the Hutu and the Tutsi could have done different?
That's a difficult question. So the mainstream idea will be to think that Rwandans never had a resistance. And we also have in conferences like this, people approaching us and being like, hey, so during the Holocaust, we had resistance, but you guys seems like you did nothing. But there was a resistance. For example, in the Bisisero Mountains, since the 60s, the Tutsi were great fighters, and they were organizing themselves because they knew the landscape better. So you'll have women and children gathering rocks and giving them to the men who were fighting in the hills. So in 1994, many Tutsi gathered on these mountains to fight back. You also have the War of Liberation, because we never got time during these conferences to talk about the end of the genocide, but it was ended by Rwandans themselves. And with an intense political lobbying campaign outside of the borders of Rwanda, and a struggle for liberation at the borders of Rwanda and then in Rwanda. So actually, many Rwandans did something before and during those 3 terrible months. They were participating either in gathering money or supporting the resistance by any means necessary. They were also trying to fight the ideology hard. But the people who were fighting ideology right before the beginning of the genocide, because we have to understand that once it started, the machinery was so sophisticated that it was really hard to just stop. The weapons were distributed throughout the entire country. The militias were ready, dispatched everywhere. You had the radio, the newspaper, the government that was leading the genocide. So once it started, there was not much to do about it from the inside. It was only about the war of liberation that came from the outside, Uganda. To be precise. But people really resisted before the genocide, and that's why the first murders targeted the politicians who were anti-extremism. For example, the first, the prime minister was assassinated with 10 of her Belgian guards. She knew it was about to happen. She was also giving an interview that same day, the 6th of April, saying the genocide is here. You have to do something to the international community. And of course, she said that in vain. But resistance was there before, during the genocide, but the machinery was literally too sophisticated. And also, genocidaires had a huge help from outside. France, I didn't have time to really explain this, but when Belgium eventually gave up and independence came, let's say a decade after, France took that place, that position of the leading Western country, and it was taken into what we call France-Afrique. So these countries that are under France's influence. So France helped the genocidal governments before, during, and after the genocide, financing it, sending weapons, giving political advices, and as a proof of that, the genocidal government was constituted in the French embassy, in the building of the French embassy. Then during the genocide, the genocidal governments, the Hutu power government of Rwanda, was actually occupying one of the seats in the Security Council at the UN. You know, those seats that are kept for other countries than the 5 big ones. So they were able to share their own narrative to explain that, no, listen, this is not exactly a genocide. This is an attack from the Tutsi rebellion, and we have to defend ourselves. And France helped, of course, that narrative from the inside of the Security Council of the UN. So, yeah, that's the situation back then.
I have what I think might be a question. So it's one of those things that people always do where they think it's a question, but it may not be a question. So I remember in 1994, 1993, 1994, there was so little news in the U.S. about these events that I actually found out years later. And I found out by, a number of movies started to come out, a number of novels started to come out. And I suppose, talking about Kabuki, is that, I'm pronouncing it correctly?
Kwibuka.
Kwibuka. We'll work on this. But I was wondering, in your opinion, in terms for those of us who were not there or are learning about it much later, are there movies or, my clients, we're reading Small Country, so we're just going to start discussing it. But are there some novels or movies that you think do a better job at getting to the whole truth and not skewing? Because I feel like there are some novels and some movies that skew, that I'm not going to say they're just as bad as those, but yeah. So I think there's a question there. Yeah.
So in terms of movies, I'm really picky. Because sometimes, even if the intention is good and the events are well described, you have this flavor of negrophobia and white saviorism behind it. So I will naturally advise for you to watch movies directed by Rwandans, or, for example, Little Country is a movie. Also, Scholastic Mukasonga's Our Lady of the Nile is a beautiful, beautiful book and a movie. And it's actually about the 70s in a girl high school in the countryside. And you could think that it will not be sufficient to understand the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, but it's actually very brilliantly written and directed. In terms of books, I think the best is to read testimonies from survivors. We have so many of them, and these are historical pieces, and also it's literature. It's beautiful literature. Unfortunately, because I'm French and French speaking, I only know about the titles in French, but I will gladly share a list of my favorites because they've been translated, most of them. And also we have so many survivors that are English speaking people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we're at time, unless someone has any other pressing questions. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for your attendance. And Jessica Mwiza, I thank you so very much for a very informative, wonderful presentation. I took 2 pages of notes. So thank you once again. And thank you everyone for your attendance. Also, Leslie, there are cookies, tea, and coffee. So help yourself on your way out. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.